Hi and welcome to yet another video. I'm glad you could make it. On today's video, part 3, we'll actually be continuing from where we left on our previous video. But specifically on this part, we'll actually be adding a database to our file. So to our app. So what's the essence of a database? For those who are familiar to database, we know that a database is basically used to store large amounts of data that can actually be accessed by, let's say, our app. And not only our app, maybe even our website. And on today's video, on our app, we'll actually be adding an SQLite database. You might be familiar to many, a wide variety of databases, but for our case, we'll actually be using the SQLite. So why are we using the SQLite instead of other databases like SQL and MongoDB? The reason why we're doing this is because SQLite is actually stored as a single file on our local machine. That's different to other databases in that for the other databases, you need to host your database on a server for it to be accessed maybe by your website. But in our case, that we don't need to do that much work. We'll only be using SQLite, which will actually be stored as a file on our local machine. So let's get started. Before we write any code, we'll actually do a short recap of what we did on our previous video. And so on our previous video, we worked on the folders page. Let me run the main file. On our previous video, we worked on all this and created the various widgets. And apart from that, we also binded some events, the hover event, which makes this background change color whenever our cursor hovers on top of the app. And we actually did some great work. I love the UI. It actually looks very nice. So we also created this, which will be our template of how we'll be displaying all the folders that we want to check for images, and they'll be listed on this column. So to add our database, go ahead and create a new file and call it database.py. Database.py. To use the SQLite database, we'll be using the SQLite 3 for Python. So for those who haven't installed this on their machine, go ahead and open your CMD. Let me do so, CMD, and run the following command: pip install db-sqlite3. Mine's already installed, so that's why this output is different. But for those who haven't yet installed it, go ahead and run that command. So remember, as we mentioned, as an OOP based practice, it's actually good if you create a class with a name similar to your file. That's why I'll be creating mine and calling it database. After creating it, go ahead and write your init function. So remember, everything inside the init function will be, every command will be ran once you initialize your database. So how do we create a database file? Go ahead and create a variable. I'll call mine db.connect. I'm sorry. So after creating a variable, send it to a value SQLite 3 dot connect, and in here is the name that you want to give to your database. So what does this line of code do? This actually creates a database if none exists, but if one exists, let's say you had already created a database, it connects your app to the database, making you able to run commands directly towards the database from another interface. In our case, it will be from our app. So let's see how this works. That alone creates. So after creating our database, what we want to do is create a table. So in databases, for those who don't know, data is stored inside tables. We may have multiple tables, and each table has multiple columns where we give the column a name relevant to what it will be storing. Let's say in a case where you're taking a roll call, maybe for your work colleagues or maybe fellow students, you have maybe a table which on the first column contains the name. The column is name, meaning it contains the name of your colleagues or students. The second column may be the age. The third column may be their phone number, and so on. In our case, that's actually similar to what we do in databases. You basically create a table, and inside a table, you create multiple columns where you'll store data relevant to the name of the column. So let's create our table. So to create our table, we'll actually need to run a command through our database. To run any command, you need to reference your variable, then .execute, then add some quotation marks, and right here is where you write the database commands. In our case, since we are creating a database, we'll go ahead and write not creating a database, creating a table. Create table. Then you specify the name of your table. Ours will be folders. After specifying that, you need to specify the columns that you want to add. In our case, our column will be ID. You'll notice that in most databases, when you're creating a table, it must have an ID, which is usually the first column. That's what you're doing. After giving the name of your column, you specify the data type of the values you'll be entering inside that column. And since it's our ID, we'll also specify it as our primary key. Then after our ID column, we want to add another column called location. No, I'll call it path. So from the name, you know that we'll obviously be storing the path to our folders. For the data type, it will actually be taking text. So in SQLite, integer is the same int, but for the string, we don't say string, we use the word text. What else? The path, then the name of the folder, which will also be text. Or let's start with name, then path. So our first column will be ID, then name, then path, and lastly the date which we added the folder. And you can see that all our data types are text except for the ID column. So this basically creates a table with 4 columns: the ID, name, path, and date. That's basically what we'll be needing. So before we continue, we'll actually initialize our class that it creates our database. Remember, just create a variable and assign it to our class. So look at this column. After I run, you can see it creates another file called app.db. So this is actually our database. So in our app.db, it actually created the app and created our table. But let's say it's not your first time running this. In this case, when you run it for the second time, you actually see it brings up an error. Table folder already exists. So what do we do to ensure that whenever we'll be running it for the second or third time, that it doesn't create a table for the second time which brings up an error? What do we do? Go ahead and import the OS. Import OS. So we'll basically use OS to check for the files inside our current working directory, which is this folder, everything inside this folder, and check whether our database file exists. So this is what we'll write: if the name of our database app.db not in os.list directory. So let me explain this. os.list directory lists all the files inside the folder that you're currently in. In our case, it's the image gallery app. So it loops through all the folders and checks whether our app.db file exists. If it does not, that's why you're using not in. If it does not exist, it actually runs this and creates our table. But what if it exists? What do we want it to do? If it exists, we want it to write an else. We only want it to connect without creating the table. So we'll just repeat this line of code. Right. So we've already created our table, but we also want to add data inside the table. So how do we do this? So go ahead and create another folder, and not another folder, another function, and call it add folder. So we've seen that to add a folder inside our table, we have to have these columns: the ID, name, path, date. So we'll also require the user to give us those values that we enter them. So after creating your function in the attributes area, write the values that you need. You start by the name, the path, date. I'll actually explain why we didn't have toward the ID. So how do we add data inside a table? So self.db.execute. So to add data, you need to write the following command: insert into. You give the name of your table. In our case, it was the folders. Then you specify the columns that it has, but you'll also be omitting the ID again. So the name, date. This name should be the specific name of the columns we listed when creating the table. We need to give the exact name, path, date, as we did so, and in the correct order. So name, path, and date. So after doing that, you need to specify the values that you want to add, values, then write another bracket. So I'll actually show you the first method if you want to add data. Remember in our previous video, we said that instead of using the plus sign, you just use the F value, then use curly braces. These special types of brackets are called curly braces. So inside the curly braces is where you add the values, not the values, the variables. So instead of using the plus sign, you just use the F, then the curly braces, and specify your variables. It actually gives you some clean code. It actually shows the people that are viewing this that you're actually a pro. So it will add the name, path, and date. So this is the first method in adding the values of your table. But for security purposes, you're not supposed to add the data directly inside the values. So what's the other method? Instead of adding the variables that have the data, just write question marks. So the number of question marks should correspond to the number of values that you have to add that the columns require. So in our case, we need to add the name, path, and date. These are 3. So we'll write 3 question marks separated by commas. Then outside this, write a comma and add a bracket. This is where here is where you'll add the values: name, path, and date. This is actually the best practice. This is what I'll be using onwards, and it's actually what I also recommend to you instead of using the other method. So this basically adds the data. After adding the data, you need to save the data. So how do you save the data added in a database? You just reference the variable you use, but add the dot commit. Without this, whenever you'll be running your program again, you'll see that whatever you added, maybe creating a table, all the adjustments you made won't have been saved, meaning that your database will be blank. So we've already added a folder. Next, we also want to delete a folder. So create a function delete folder. But in this case, we don't want a lot of values. So I want this to only take one attribute, which is the name, but don't forget the self attribute. So how do we delete values inside a table? Remember self.db.execute. So to delete, you need to write the following: delete from, then specify the name of your table, folders. Delete from folders. Then to specify the specific data that you want to delete, you write where, then you list the column. I'll be using the name column, where name is equal to, you have to note that you're not using 2 equal signs, instead you're using 1. So add the F where name equals to the name. So our second name is the value we gave here, but this first one is the name of the column. So what does this do? It deletes all the data in the table you specified. In our case, it's the folders where the name, which specifies the column, is equal to the exact value you gave. Meaning that when it detects the row that has the value specified in the name column, it will actually delete the whole row. You'll actually see that in the following. Okay. So after deleting, remember you have to save any change made to the database. So how do you do this? You just write self.db.commit. Nice. So we'll write a third function to actually list. I'll call mine list folders. So to get values of tables from our database, we need to write the following. Remember the self value. So go ahead and reference the variable is to create your database self.db.execute. So to get all the values from the table, you need to write the following command. Select the asterisk sign. As I had mentioned in some other video, this asterisk sign tells the program that you're referring to everything. So in our context, it will actually be telling the database to select everything from the name of the table folders. Yes, select everything from the name of the, so it is folders. Note that the spelling must be the same. Omitting a single letter will actually make the whole program not work. So this will actually return all the values of the folders, but returning it doesn't mean that you see them. For us to see it, we need to print the values. So how do we do this? We'll loop through this command. So I'll go ahead and write for I in this command. So I'll print I. So let's run this. Okay. So after, let me delete this. I'd already created. So what's the first thing we do? After initializing a class, it creates a table. But for us to see something visible, we need to first add some data to the table. Okay, so I'll do the following: db dot see the add folder. Okay. So it takes 3 values as specified here. The first is name. I'll give mine user. The second one is path. So this is just an example for me for it to help you understand more on what we are doing. Next is the date. 1/1/2020. So this is the first. We also want to add another value. So that will be the first column. Second will be maybe pictures. So before we continue, I actually forgot to mention something. If you actually noted, when adding the folder, we only used 3 columns, whereas when we were creating our table, it required 4 columns. So why did we do this? So as you can see, when we were creating our our table, the folders, we actually specified our first column as the ID column, which takes a data type of integer and a primary key. So by assigning our ID to an integer, when assigning it as a primary key, this tells the program that this number will not be the same in any instance, meaning that in all cases, the number should be different. So in SQLite 3, it actually holds a feature called auto increment. As you can tell from the word auto, meaning automatic, and increment, meaning increase, it automatically increases the number in that column. So in our case, the ID will be automatically increased. Maybe the first one was 1, the second will be 2. And since it's automatically increased, we are not the one who handles that section. It's the database itself that handles the ID. That's why when adding data, we actually don't need to refer to that column again. Instead, our database automatically increases the ID from one row to another. I hope I made that clear. So let's go ahead and run. Okay, before running it, we want it to list. Want it to list the folders. So let me run this. Nice. You can actually see it listed the first data, which was 1, the name of the folder, the path, the date. The second one ID is 2, name is pictures, path, date. As you can see, we actually didn't add the ID, but it's automatically handled by the database, as I mentioned. So before finishing this part, we actually want to try deleting. So db.delete folder actually takes a single value, the name. So we'll be deleting these values, the user. So the name should be user. It will delete all the values where the name is user. So let's run this. Oh, before we run this, you actually need to make some changes. Where you created your delete folder function on the first line, delete from folders where name equal to, you actually need to add a single quotation mark around the variable that you'll be adding, but outside the curly braces. After you're done with that, let's run it. Nice, you can actually see it actually ended up deleting that, and that's why when we list our folders, it actually brings only the pictures folders. So I'm actually done handling, not completely done, but we'll now go and handle the folder page. So let me delete this. So when you go ahead and delete that, and also delete your app.db file, your database file, and go to your folders page. So you can see that we actually created a folder page and we added a plus button. Remember, it was a button. Now in this video is where we'll be giving the button a function, and what this button will basically do, it will actually bring up a file dialog that will actually explain, and after bringing up the file dialog, the user should select where he or she wants the folder to be added. So what is the file dialog? Have you ever tried downloading a file maybe from your browser and immediately a window pops up and asks you where you want to save your downloads? It asks for the destination file. Now, the window that pops up is what is called a file dialog, and and that's what we'll be using to actually help the user select where he or she wants to the folder. So how do we do this in custom Tkinter? Go ahead to a folder page and import the file dialog. So write the following from Tkinter. Tkinter comes right out of the box with Python, so there's no installing. From Tkinter, import file dialog. Nice. And also, we'll also import the database file, the class, from database import database. So the first name database refers to our file database.py, but our second name database refers to the class inside that file. So we are basically importing the class database from the file. So we'll start by initializing our database. So how do we do this? We basically assign it to a variable. So I'll create a variable and call it self.database and assign it to the database. So remember that you first have to delete this. Delete the database file if you haven't yet deleted it. So after initializing this, you need to create another function, maybe down here, and call it add folder. So what should this do? This function should actually bring up a file dialog, as I explained, and from this file dialog, the user should select the path, the folder which he or she wants to add to your app. Then after that, we load that into the database. So how do we do this? Create a variable. I'll call mine location. And that I'll assign it to the file dialog. So the file dialog has many uses. You can use it to ask where you want to save the file. You can actually see from this list all the uses, but in our case, we'll be using the ask directory. So after running this basically returns the path where you selected. But if you didn't select any path, or maybe you selected the cancel, it actually gives a blank to the variable location. So after creating a variable, you'll write if location. So what does this do? This checks whether the variable location is blank or it contains the path. And the code that will write down here will only be ran if the path is not a blank. So what do we want to do afterwards? So after this, we want to load the value inside the database. Remember the cell. So I'll go ahead and reference the variable we used to initialize our database, self.database.add folder. You can see it takes the name, the path, the date. Yes. Okay. So this variable location returns the file path, but you first need to edit the file path for you to get maybe the name. So how do we do this? I'll be introducing a new concept known as the splits. If you're actually familiar to Python strings, you know that we have a function known as the split that is actually used with strings. So what does this do? So you basically okay, let's say we want to get the name. I'll create a variable name. I'll explain as I write the code. So location. So the variable you're using must be a string. In our case, the path from the file dialog is returned as a string. So you write your variable dot split. then brackets. So inside this brackets, you specify where you want to split your string. So add quotation mark. So in our case, we'll be using this. So what does this do? It actually goes through this variable, the text, and looks for all signs that look like this, and it splits them. Then assigns the value into a list. I'll actually show you what I mean. So after splitting this, it actually creates a list containing values. Let me actually show you. Let's print name. For you to understand, we have to run this. I'm doing this for the newbies. We didn't assign this to the button, so use the button. Now folder page. Yes, here it is. So go ahead to your button and add the command cell dot add folder. So let's run this again. Now this is the file dialog. So you see it contains a list. So all I have to do is select. Remember, if you press cancel, it actually bring a blank. So it won't continue. But let's select maybe the documents and press the select folder. So putting aside this error, let's go back. Yes, you can see this is what I wanted to explain. You can see it actually brings a list. It actually splits. As you know, the path is written using this forward slash, as you can see from what I'm pointing here. It actually splits and removes them, then puts the remaining data into a list. So as you can see, you have a list that contains the C, the users, the user, the document. That's what split does. So, but why are we using the split? We're using the split so that we can separate the path and get the last name inside that list. So the last name will be the documents. So this last name is what we want to give us the name of the folder. So how do we do this? We have already split this. So for us to do this, we'll go back. Right here, name. Since I don't want to create another variable, I just write the same variable. What it will do is that it will just reassign the value is equals to name. So this name refers to these values. And now, since this is a list, you can actually use something called an index. So an index is actually used to tell the program the position of a text. But for indexes, the number usually starts from 0. So in our case, our first value, which is C, then a colon, is at the 0 index. But we actually don't want to get the first index. We want to get the last. So what do? You'll come first, you'll get the length of the text of the list. So how do we get the length? You write the word len, add the brackets, then add your variable length name. So if we, in our case, what will it give us as the length? The length refers to the number of items. In our case, it has the C, users, and documents. So these are 1, 2, 3, and 4. It will return a 4. But as you can note, it returns a 4. But when you are counting using the index, it starts from 0. So when it starts from 0, what will it give us? 0, 1, 2, 3. Meaning, What's the difference between the length and the index? The difference is only 1. So how do we get the index of the last item? We'll only minus by 1. So in our case, when you get the length, it will actually be C users. The length will actually be 1, 2, 3, 4. But what about the index? It will be 0, 1, 2, 3. How do you get 3 from 4? You just minus 1. So this will be used to get the index. So we've only looked for the index. So what do? We add this to the square brackets and write the variable name. So let me explain this for the last time. What this does is, by using the word name and assigning square brackets, you're basically telling the program that you're going to use indexing to get the value at the current index, at the index that you have specified. So inside these corner brackets, you must specify a number that refers to the index of the text. So what will be our index? Our index will be the length of the variable minus 1. Since we've seen that when getting the length, the program starts from 1. But when getting the index, the program starts from 0. That's why we need to get the length of our variable name. We minus it by 1. Then that gives us the index of the last value. I hope you have understood that. If you haven't, you can actually comment down below and I could maybe give you a sample code which will help you explain, which will help you understand. So after doing that, so this name gets the value at this index, so it gets the last value. And you can see that to add our database, it requires how many values? It requires 3 values. The first value is name. We've already gotten the name, so we write name, which refers to this variable. What about the second one? The second one will be path. So for our path, it will be the location. What next? The next is date. So we want to get the current date. So how do we do that? We actually explained that on the previous video. So we'll only do date dot today, and we are done adding a folder. So this is what it will do. It will basically do. So after adding our folder, we actually want to display the folder on our app. So how do we do this? Go ahead, go back to your database file, and we'll create a variable and call it folders self dot folders. But the only difference with this variable is that our variable will be a list. So what do I mean by list? It means that it will store a set of values. So it will store a set of values folders. So self.folders, and the next one will be self.folder names. This will also be a list. So as you can tell, the folders will actually store the path, folder path. Let me write that. The second will be the folder name, and we'll also create self.folder date. So each will store the first one will store the path, the second name, that date. We also need to create another function. I'll change this to get folders. For I, select db from folders. So instead of printing, we want to store the data inside these lists so that we can access it in our path. So if we go back, let me go back. You can see it started by storing in each iteration, in each loop, it gave us a list. So one, user, the path, the name. So how do we add this name from this? How do we get the data from this list and add it to our variables? So first we'll start by, we'll assign. I will start by the name. So cell dot folder names dot append. So for you to add data inside a list, you need to use the word append. But what will be appending? You'll reference the I, but remember the concept of index. Add the square brackets. Then where is our name? On which index? So this is our name. But at what index? The index starts from 0. So this is 0, then 1, meaning our index will be 1. So go ahead and write 1. Then write the same for self dot folder path dot append I, then as square brackets. So where is our path? The path is the third item. So the third item is 0, 1, 2. So on the second index, remember the square brackets is for the index. Then for the folder dates, self dot folder date dot append I, then a square bracket. So where is the date? 0, 1, 2, 3. And we are done adding. So, but for safety purposes, not exactly safety purposes, to prevent adding folder names for multiple times, we want to ensure that before adding new names, we want to first of all delete everything from that list to prevent repetition, as I'll explain later. So how do we delete all the values inside list? You'll go ahead and reference your folders, your list, sorry. But now instead of appending, we'll actually use clear. Clear. So this deletes everything inside the list. Clear. So this basically removes everything inside the list to prevent repeated addition of letters, which will lead to multiple similar values. So we've already gotten the folders and added it to our list. So we need to get the folders from our folder page. But before that, we'll go ahead and edit here. So after creating the list here, sorry, as you can note, it is in the init function. We want to tell the program to automatically get the folders. So that when the app will be loading, you don't have to wait for you to get the folder. It will automatically. So after initializing, it will create the database, create the table. And if this, and immediately self.get folders. So this will add the values inside this list. So on this other end, we'll go ahead. We've already added. So we'll actually use our template. Our template, the one we used to display the folders, we'll actually use that as a template to display multiple folders. So after creating the function add folder, we'll create the function load folder. So what will the load folder function be doing? What this function will be doing is that it will be displaying the multiple folders from our database. So for it to do this, it needs to loop through this list that we created that will be storing the data from our folder. So we'll go ahead and do this. For I in, so this will actually give it the number of times that it will loop. For I in length, the length of one of the lists, I'll use maybe the name, the folder names. So we used self.database dot folder names. So it will actually loop depending on the names. Remember that the number of items should actually be the same in both the lists, since we're getting the data from the same table. For I in the length, what should it do? Now, here is where we'll be using the template we created. So here's the template. So the template begins from here, self.folder up to, so go ahead and copy all this. So right below the folder frame, go ahead and copy all this, except for the close and the delete. Yes, up to the folder1.bind. No, even the delete. So you'll only be leaving the close. Go ahead and cut it all. Then, as I mentioned, that will be the template. So go ahead and add it in our list. So you need to be careful and make sure that all this is inside the for loop. So you need to indent it. You need to push it back a little. Yes. So by looping through, it will make sure that we create multiple search templates, not search templates, search widgets. But when you're looping, you want to give it different values, maybe depending on the name of the folder and even the date, as we noted. That is what we want to change. So we'll go ahead. We'll first start with the folder name. You see, in this case, we actually gave it the name pictures, but going on, we don't want to give it the value manually. We want it to get the value from the list that we created. Remember, we created the list. the folder name, folder path, folder date. And since this section is the name, it will be getting the value from the folder name. So let me come here and write name is equals to self dot, remember the name that you use for your database, dot folder names. And since you're using the length for I in length of this, meaning the I are values, now we'll be using our I as the index. If you actually don't understand this, comment below. I'll actually share a link maybe in the next video. This is for name. Next, we'll create the path. Path is equal to self dot database dot folder path. We'll do the same. The index is the I, since the I is for I in the length. For I in the length of the folder name. And the last one will be date. Date is equals to self dot database dot folder, yes, folder date. And you do the same. I will be the index. So this name, path, and date is what we'll use inside here. So this is where, here is where we selected we added the name of our path. So we'll go ahead and change this and assign it to our variable name. Yes. Then locate the next one, which will be our date. So we'll remove this date today and add the variable date. Where else? Date. We aren't actually storing the path. No, we won't be needing the path, so can as well delete this. Let me comment this out. Yes, we won't need this at all. Let me delete it. Okay. So whenever it's looping, since the I changes, also the name changes, the index. Hence, it will give you different values. That's good. So what do we do? Okay. In our load folders, in our add folders. Okay. So in our add folders, when we add a folder, we also want the values inside here to change. When we are adding a folder, we also want to the values inside the app to change. So how do we do this? We'll ensure that each and every time after we add the folder, we call this function. So we'll create a callback. So go back to the database.add folder. So after this, create another variable, call it callback. So what this basically does is that you can give a function as an attribute, so that when it's done doing this, it calls that function. So after committing this, insert into, we want to call the dot get folder, so that it gives us a fresh list containing all the changes. We also do the same for the delete folder. But let's first start with this. So we need to write the self dot get folders. So this basically gets all the folders. Then after that, we need to call our callback. So this callback is a function. Return the callback, shift callback, and the callback. But we haven't specified our callback in here. So how do we specify our callback inside the add folder? Since we say the callback is a function, we will return these add folders. So I'll go ahead and write self dot add folder. To prevent any future errors, we need to add a try and except. To avoid any errors. Go back to your folder page and change this. In our callback, you actually specified add folder instead of load folders. We've actually known where the issue is. So here, where we are supposed to loop, it should not be for I in len, it should be for I in range. Then this is where we specify our value. So let me run this. Nice. You can actually see it actually brought up the name of the folder. But as you can see from this bottom list, you actually had multiple values. But where did the issue come in? Let me use the add button, maybe at the Adobe folder. It actually changes. So where does the problem actually come in? As you can see, it actually places it at one place, but we actually want to create we remember we created a scrollable frame. Let me show you. We actually created a scrollable frame. So it will actually be listing all those folders in a list. But why doesn't it list? This is because at this point, we actually didn't specify. As you can see, the row is constant 0 in the column 0, but we want to change this such that after every iteration, we want the row to change since it's the row that changes. But since our number changes, we'll only use the I value. So let's go ahead and try this. So this I brings back a number. And we obviously know that the number begins from 0. So it will start from the first column 0 and continue until it's done with the list. So if we run this again, let's run it. You can actually see this actually looks nice. But if you note, when we hover over all these, it actually only hovers over these. So we need to go back to our code and look at our binded events. So as you can see here, when we binded, we gave it a self.item frame that's actually similar to in all, but since we are looping through and creating variables with the same name, we need to specify in this event that we're referring to the current value, so that even after the value changes, this doesn't affect. So how do we do this? So as you can see here, you wrote the self.item frame. Go ahead, after this item frame, create a variable. I'll call mine item frame, where which will use to assign it to the self.item frame. The only reason I'm doing this is because because what we want to do next won't actually be possible if we have this self and the full stop. It will actually bring up an error. Self.item frame. Then go to where you've binded your event. After the word event, add a colon and then write item frame is equals to item frame, and you change here. So you'll have to repeat this same process for all the events. Remove that issue. So I'll just copy and paste. So this value refers to what you're adding to the value that your function that you banded takes. So it needs to be the same way after we created a lambda event, we use the same variable here. That's the same thing, the same case. So I'll go ahead and do the same for all the rest. I'm almost done. Finally, this. So before you actually run this, I also want to make some few adjustments. As you had noticed, the frames are actually, they're too squeezed, so I need to change the border between each. So to change this, since it's on the y-axis, I need to add a pad y. So as you can note, it is inside this grid, and maybe give it a value of, let me give it a value of 5. And let's run it. Nice. As you can see, if I hover on each, it is the exact widget that changes the color. And as you can see, it has actually created many folders. So the last one is Adobe. So whenever I press the add button, maybe for a change, let me add the videos. Then I press on select folder. If I scroll down, you can see the videos folder has been added, and it writes the current date when it was added. So we need to change this padding and then work on the delete button. So for our delete button, let's first change this. I'll change this pad Y to 3. So for our delete button, we wanted to delete the database. So how do we do this? Go ahead and create another folder, delete folder. And then I'll reference the database. So self, did it include it here? Let me do so. To self dot database dot delete folder. So the name, this takes the name, so I'll have to take also include the name. But now before deleting it, we actually want to ask the user, are you sure you want to delete this? So we'll introduce another feature called the message box. So go ahead and import. I'll just do this right beside this from Tekita. So import the file dialog and the message box. So I'll create a variable ask, then I'll assign it to message box dot ask yes no. So it takes two values. The first value is the title. So our title will be delete a folder. Then the next value is the question we want to ask. So I'll ask, so since I'll be using the name of the folder, I'll add the F, then I'll ask, are you sure you want to delete the, now this is where we'll add the name folder, I'll add a single quotation marks around this. Then since this checks a yes no, we'll come down here and write if ask. This means if you actually write if, means that this will be carried out if the answer is yes. If the answer is no, this line of code won't be carried out. So I'll just write if, so self.database.delete folder, then the name of the folder, as we need to specify it. So the name, it is this first name. So let's go ahead and assign it to our button. So where was our button? Should be the last here. So command goes to self dot delete folder. So if in the other cases, like in the add folder, let me show you the add. this function didn't require any attribute, any value when calling the function. But in our case, when you delete the folder, we need to give it the name. So how do we do this inside this line? So you first of all need to create a lambda. So why do we create a lambda? This ensures that this function is not called unless the button is pressed. If you don't add the lambda, the function will be called when you press the when immediately you'll be creating it. So that's why you need the lambda to ensure that we can give values and that it will only act when pressed. So how do we get the name? As remember here we use this name, so that's what we'll do. Just give it name, the variable that we used on top. So by this, it will obviously delete self.database.delete. So let's go back to the delete folder. Obviously, after deleting the folder, we want it to get the folders again. So self dot, as we did to the add folder dot get folders, and after that we want it to run. So we also need to create a callback, another callback. So what should this callback do? So I'll call mine refresh list tab def. I'll call mine refresh list. So what this does is that it first it deletes everything inside that frame for I in. So the frame was called self.folder frame. So if we first need to delete everything inside that frame, so how do we delete everything? First of all, reference the frame, folder frame, then it's children dot w info children, info shift children. So this gives it all the children, all the widgets inside. Then you destroy them. I dot destroy. Then after destroying, you need to now load the folders. So we'll carry out load folders. The self dot load folders. So this is what we'll do. The problem is I think we might see some flickering. So we need to add this as our callback. So self.delete folder, then we add our callback. Let's first of all specify that this needs a callback. After the name, we specify the callback, callback. So we say that our callback is actually a function. And how do we call functions? We just carry the return, then the callback. Don't forget the double brackets. Okay. Then before you run, you specify a callback. So callback will be self dot refresh list. So let's run this. As you can see, the space is at least better. Now let's try deleting. We'll start with this first one. This is the button. If I press, you see it actually gives the title with selected, delete a folder. Are you sure you want to delete there? Then the name of the folders. So as you can note, the name hasn't changed. It's selling us videos, whereas it's the desktop. We write yes. So let's not forget this part. This also specifies that you don't share the name, so you need to write name.name that to get the accurate value. Yes, now you can see it tells us desktop folder similar to here. Well, just click yes, and you see it gets deleted. Let's say, let's try the Adobe right? Yes, we can see it again. But now we added the documents for 3 times, meaning that if we delete this, it will actually delete all 3, remaining with 1. So let's add, let me also add another one, desktop, and finally the documents. Looks like we need to bring this a little bit down since we can't see the P. And we have actually come to the end of our video. Thanks for staying tuned. I hope to see you in the next video. So don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell notification so that you get informed as we'll be going to the next interesting part. We'll actually be loading the images. Thank you for staying tuned. Let's meet in the next video.